Hey, my new template has burst onto the scene and I'm gonna walk you through all the steps on how to use it in today's quick tip. Let's get started. Here's our finished block from the verse block, and you can see we are using 1/4 inch seam allowances, and I want to point out that all of my pressing is away from the center with each of my steps. You'll need at least 2 different fabrics. I have 10-inch squares. The print or the color fabric you see in the quilt behind me is simply divided down the center with a long ruler, cut like this, easy. Set those aside, you're gonna need them. Then my burst block template fits right here, tip to tip, and this is gonna be cut creating 3 pieces, I should say, a wedge and 2 triangles. Now these triangles are not exactly the same, so I want you to keep them in the orientation. So I build myself piles in my workstation just like this so that I can work from them. The first sewing step you're gonna use, you're gonna take your wedge and those 2 yellow triangles. Now your scraps continue to build so you don't trash those scraps. You're gonna sew this on, and I always leave myself about 1/2 inch down here as I'm starting. Those get pieced right on there, like I said, with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when they're all finished, it looks just like that. You're going to first start, there's 3 key markers with each cut. Always our etched wedge shape that is right on the template is always gonna lay on the wedge when you're cutting, because we're gonna be flipping our template both sides, and that's why I've used dots instead of numbers. So then you're gonna find your first dot because we're on our first seam. So that I look for. Then I make sure that my wedge is on my fabric wedge. And the third step is I slide this up and I make sure that this tip is touching somewhere down here on the back end of the wedge itself. And then I'm gonna cut, saving that piece for later because I need it for later. Now watch what happens. There's a 90-degree marker also. So I'm gonna cut my big 90 up here first. Then I'm gonna flip the template over. And once again, my first dotted line, because I'm on my first seam, my wedge is on my wedge, and this tip down here is gonna line up on the other side of the wedge. Now I've got my right hand holding my template, my left hand's got my cutting tool in it there. Little awkward, but it works just as nice. Then the 90 up here. And you want to make sure you take good time to make sure those 90 stay 90, because that's the whole square of the block. And this really helps when we're dealing down here with this short point. You can actually take your ruler, or excuse me, your template, and line it up. You just want to make sure that your tip is there, your tip is here, and this is going to help us give a really good starting 90-degree square edge down here after our first sewing strips and our first cuts. Once that is done, right, you're going to simply bring those triangles that were created in the first cut from the template, and notice they're coming right back in the way they were cut off of the wedge. And I'm going to again start with a little bit of, I'm going to call it 1/2 inch down here before I start my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when that is sewn together, it's going to look just like this one. See it? So we're just going to keep building. Now, the steps remain the same, but I have a second dotted line, and I'm going to line that up. I'm making sure my wedge, oops, my wedge is on the wrong side. So I make sure I flip it over. The wedge is on the wedge. There I've got my second line, and now I'm looking at my tip down here, and I'm gonna go ahead and move this over because I'm looking at the wrong line. Well, I guess the caffeine's kicked in. Okay, so second line, wedge on the wedge. I'm gonna slide this up so my tip's hitting there. Yes, it hits in a different spot than it did on the first cut, but it's going to be accurate if you do that over and over like that. I'm squaring. I'm flipping my ruler. I always square that small end last. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, wedge on the wedge, dot 2 on seam 2, and my tip is back here, cutting left-handed, but safely. I'm gonna 90 square off the top here. After you do this a few times, it becomes very, very fluid for you. Now down here, I can use my regular 90 marker from the template itself because I had such a nice cut to begin with. And you'll notice I'm constantly flipping and or rotating the template, and that's why all the markings are dots and shapes and not numbers, okay? There we are. We've already gone through our second seam and we're making a bit of a mess. Your yellow scraps or your print scraps that you had before, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it's going to look just like this one when it's done. Okay? Wedge on the wedge, 3rd dotted line on the 3rd seam line, tip back here on the tip. Take a deep breath, slow it down a bit, Rob, and go ahead and make a nice cut. Come up here, my R2 unit's telling me the coffee's almost ready. So we've got that going there. I'm gonna flip this over, bring this around. Remember, 3rd dot, wedge on the wedge, tip on the tip, so I need to slide that a little bit. Slide through there. Making sure I'm nice and square still. And of course I would come down and do the same at the bottom, moving on. But what I really want to point out after I get that cut made is there's going to be a flat edge. And it doesn't actually run all the way through. The flat edge, it only goes through here. So when you take your little black scrap, this will be the last seam you're going to make, you're going to line that up. You still want it to come long. I don't want you to bend that black as you're sewing it on. I want you to leave it nice and clean so that when you're all finished, on both sides of course, you'll have a block that looks like this. There's no 4th dotted line on here. All you have to do at this point is simply use your 90 and square out your block. So I'm going to take a nice time to line this up, and I'm going to square here. I'm going to rotate. I'm going to rotate the template itself. I'm coming down here. I'm squaring, spinning block, splitting template, whatever you like to do. I'm squaring, and the last cut, but squaring off of a real square corner. I come up here, looks perfect, and voila, we have a beautiful finished burst block. You know all the steps of the template, and there's all kinds of fun settings you can do once you've created these squares. If you want to trim them up, all you can when you're done, but I found that this template is very, very accurate, so you should be finished at that step. Hope you enjoyed today's quick tip. Now get back and get sewing.